today's panel. For those unfamiliar with the organizing partners, SAAPRI is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization established in 2001. Through community-based research and strategic partnerships, SAAPRI drives impactful policy change at local, regional, and national levels. It is dedicated to empowering South Asian Americans by advancing data equity and ensuring that our communities are accurately represented in public policy. SAAJCO is a civil rights and legal services nonprofit committed to advancing the civil and human rights of the South Asian diaspora in the United States through direct legal services, community engagement, and impact litigation. Thank you to both organizations for bringing us together. We'd also like to thank the SABA Foundation and Indiaspora for their generous support of this series. This series, the Engaged Community Series, is designed to create space for South Asians and allies to access knowledge, exchange ideas, and to connect with the resources that support justice and equity. Each month, we've been exploring one of three core and interrelated themes: know your rights, unpacking hate, and civic participation in democracy through conversations with expert speakers, advocates, and community leaders. We're living in a time where rights that we once assumed were safe and settled are under attack. As federal diversity, equity, and inclusion policies are rolled back, workplace protections, especially for women, people of color, and LGBTQ+ employees, are being questioned, weakened, or quietly ignored. But rights just don't disappear because of political shifts. Our panel today, Workplace Discrimination and Legal Protections in a Changing Landscape, is about knowing what our rights are and then defending them. It's about truth-telling and strategy, and it's about building workplaces that value dignity, equity, and justice, not just in our mission statements, but in how we live and how we practice. To help us navigate this moment, I'm so honored to welcome two powerhouse women whose work spans the courtroom, the Capitol, and our communities. First, we have Tarina Mand, who's a purpose-driven employment attorney and fierce advocate for justice. She's a skilled litigator and trial attorney, and she represents employees in discrimination, harassment, and assault matters, while also handling pre-litigation cases like severance negotiations. She just recently launched her own firm, and we're so excited for her, and also serves as of counsel with the Dixon Law Firm on major class action and mass tort matters. Beyond the courtroom, she has shaped policy and led national efforts for equity in the legal profession. She's a past president of the South Asian Bar Association of San Diego and former chair of SABA's Racial Justice Task Force. She currently also serves on the boards of California Asian Pacific American Bar Association and California Women's Lawyers. She also led the Equal Pay Transparency Initiative and testified before the California Assembly in support of a first-in-the-nation state-level caste discrimination ban. Her work has earned her numerous honors, including the Federal Bar Association's Rising Attorney Award and recognition as a Super Lawyers Rising Star from 2023 to 2025. Tarina, thank you so much for joining us. We also have Sharmili Majumdar, who brings decades of experience advancing gender equity and systemic change. As Executive Vice President of Policy and Organizational Impact at Women Employed, she leads strategy to improve economic conditions and expand rights for working women, especially women of color and those in low-wage jobs. Her leadership helped win landmark victories like paid sick days, salary history bans, and expanded pregnancy accommodations. But her work isn't just about policy, it's about power. She serves on numerous boards and coalitions, using her voice to bridge grassroots advocacy and legislative action, including at the Crossroads Fund, a public foundation that supports grassroots organizations doing racial, social, and economic justice work. Whether she's testifying before lawmakers or mentoring the next generation of advocates, she embodies the belief that lasting change is both possible and necessary, especially in the workplace. Sharmili, thank you so much for joining us as well today. And one quick note, our session is being recorded and will be available afterward on the SAAPRI and SAAJCO platforms. Please feel free to share your questions using the Q&A function. We'll get to as many as we can during or after our discussion. So my first question for you both, please introduce yourselves briefly and share what drew you to this work around workplace discrimination. Sharmili, I'll start with you.
Sure. Thank you so much for that introduction, and I'm so glad to be here. Um, uh, Sharmili Majmudar, my pronouns are she, her, and I'll talk just a moment about Women Employed. We're a nonprofit advocacy organization that's based in Illinois, and we focus on advancing women's economic justice through education, employment, and entrepreneurship. And we're particularly focused on closing the wealth gap that is at the intersection of race and gender. Everything about us is being impacted by everything that's going on right now, as I know is true for many of you as well. In terms of what brought me to the workplace discrimination work, the bulk of my career has actually been in gender-based violence, and particularly working directly with survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and other kinds of trauma. And in that work, I think one of the key through lines with the experiences of survivors and whether or not they had access to the kinds of things that would bring them safety and healing was what they had access to economically. And it really is kind of the difference between someone being in a position where they can chart an economically independent and safe path away from an abusive situation or whether they can't. And so that plays out in lots of different ways, that intersection of gender-based violence and economic security and stability. And all of that, I think, together has brought me to the work that I do at Women Employed, which has included doing work around sexual harassment prevention and sexual harassment related policy work as well.
Thank you, and thank you for your leadership in this space. Tarina?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you for being here. So I'm not going to go over my bio because Sufyan went through it thoroughly. But a little background on me, why I do this work is after college, I decided to go and work as a case manager for a refugee resettlement company. It was a nonprofit. I had no plans of attending law school. And while I was there, I was sexually assaulted by my boss. And getting anything filed, getting the cops to do anything, going through the legal process was so convoluted for me. And I felt like I didn't know what I was doing. And that led me to go to law school and want to help other women and other employees basically navigate the system that can sometimes be very convoluted. So shout out to SAAJCO and SAAPRI for doing this Knowing Your Rights series. It's absolutely amazing. So thank you for being here also.
Thank you. And thank you for sharing your truth and your inspiration and motivation behind doing this work. So, Tarina, let's start with you. Can you define what workplace discrimination is and how does it actually show up in our day-to-day lives?
Yeah, so workplace discrimination refers to basically unfair or unequal treatment of employees or job applicants based on characteristics such as race, gender, sexual orientation, disability, or other protected traits. It can be explicit or it can be subtle, but it always results in some sort of disadvantage, exclusion, or harm. So it can show up in hiring practices, biases in hiring practices, being paid less than, let's say, your white male counterparts or white female counterparts, being overlooked for promotions, being excluded from team meetings or trainings. Or it could be something more overt as harassment, like I talked about, or hostile work environment.
Thank you. Sharmili, I know you're not a lawyer, but how in your work, how does workplace discrimination manifest? How have you seen it manifest? Oh, you're still muted.
Sorry. Shout out to all the social workers in the room because we do a lot of different things and policy can in fact be one of them. I would just add to what Tarina shared that one of the kind of like common workplace experiences when someone experiences discrimination or harassment, et cetera, is also retaliation. It has historically, for example, been one of the #1 complaints to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission at the federal government. is actually retaliation. So this is when someone is trying to assert their rights, where they're trying to say, make a complaint and say, I was harassed or I was treated unfairly. And then they are retaliated in such a way that has material harm to them, which means, they get demoted, they get a poor performance review, they get their hours cut. There are just many, many different ways. But I think it's important to remember that if you experience discrimination, like it's not as though making a complaint about it is kind of like the end of the process, and it may not even be the end of the discrimination itself.
Thank you. A lot to think about and process. I think for our viewers, what I'd love to hash out a little bit more is what federal and state laws currently protect workers who face discrimination, and do those protections vary between federal, state, or state to state? And Tarina, I'll pass this one to you.
Yeah, so like you mentioned, employees are protected by federal laws, and then you're protected by your state-specific laws. So federal laws apply to all 50 states. So no matter which state you live in, you're protected under federal law. And that could be Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which protects against race, color, religion, sex, national origin. You have Title X of the Civil Rights Act. You have Americans with Disabilities Act. You have Age Discrimination, Equal Pay Act. All those are basically federal laws. And then you have state laws, which most often, hopefully you live in a state that expands on those federal protections. So for example, California has very strong protections for employees. I mentioned the Federal Equal Pay Act. It protects against employers paying employees of one sex less than employees of the opposite sex. So it provides for equal pay for equal work. Now, this under the federal statute is very narrow. You have to show basically that the job is like the two jobs that are being compared are basically identical. So California, what it did was broaden the protection. It said equal pay for substantially similar work. So not equal pay for equal work, but substantially similar work. And that basically makes it more inclusive. So the comparison between the jobs don't have to be identical at this point. They just have to share some important characteristics. So that's an example of how state laws can broaden what federal laws already protect against.
Thank you. Sharmili, is there any gaps that you see, especially for women and BIPOC workers?
Yeah, and sometimes those gaps can be covered by even the next level of laws, which are like local jurisdictions. So municipalities can have their own laws, counties can have their own laws as well. And those can each kind of build on each other. I'll give you a quick example. Illinois has a restroom access law that is really designed to ensure that trans and non-binary folks can use the restroom safely. And that started with a change to the Chicago Human Rights Ordinance and an amendment to that. And then after that, it kind of like built up to a state law as well. But Rena's point, that is not the law at the federal level. So you can have protections at the state level that do not exist at the federal level. And then also federal laws and state laws often have jurisdictions. So they'll say, we only cover, for example, employers with 15 employees or more. And so the gaps there can be covered by states. They're not always, though. And it's very, very dependent on where you live and where you work.
So someone who's facing harm, what would you recommend, Tarina, their first step be if they think they're being discriminated against?
Yeah, I would say first step is document everything. So make sure you're saving your emails where you've seen exclusion from hypothetically meetings or any kind of comments that have been made. You're keeping track of all those things. It's also important to express to the company what you're going through. So there are a lot of employees who want to hire an attorney, but haven't really given the employer a chance to rectify what's going on. So it's important to make a complaint with your supervisor or with HR, and to make sure it's in writing, not just an oral complaint, because a lot of employers, in my experience, have tried to just do it orally and not have anything in writing. So make sure you have that in writing, that you made a complaint, it was in writing, what date it was. But then, like Sharmili said, keep in mind when you do speak up, there might be retaliation. You might be demoted, you might be fired, you might be given a severance package to basically say, hey, we'll pay for these many weeks, but we don't want you here anymore, and sign this document basically saying you're not going to sue us in the future and we'll give you this money. So be prepared for that too. Just in the back of your mind, like when you speak up, an employer can retaliate against you, which is protected. So you do have legal recourse if that does happen. And I'll pass it to Sharmili if you want to add anything else.
I think the documentation piece is really, really important. And particularly in this day and age, it can be screenshots, it can be printouts of emails, it can be a text thread. Like there are so many ways in which discrimination and harm can be documented. So to think like about as close to the original experience of the harm is what you want to document. So if you have a screenshot, that's better than you writing, down in a journal, like what happened to you. So I would say that one thing. And then just acknowledging that for some people, like making a complaint at their employer may feel like it is just not an option. It may feel unsafe. Particularly for folks who might have vulnerabilities related to their immigration status or gender identity, or are simply working a really low wage job that they very much need to support their families. It can feel impossible to go to your employer, and the state laws that we were talking about before have enforcement agencies associated with them who you can also call. Now, to Tarina's point, they might ask you, and they will ask you actually, if you've made a complaint at the employer already, but it's not required that you have to have made a complaint at your employer in order to also access the protections that may exist through those enforcement agencies that are enforcing anti-discrimination laws.
Thank you.
Yeah.
But
sorry, just to add to that, when you do file, at least in California and most states that I know, you can't file anonymously. So when you do start an investigation, your name is going to be out there. So your employer is going to know that you filed this complaint with the EEOC or the investigative board. So just keep that in mind too.
That's helpful. Thank you. Sharmili, I'm thinking about what you said about people afraid to speak out, right? Like I see it, I worked a lot in civil rights work where especially our communities are hesitant to rock the boat sometimes because they are afraid to escalate matters. Working with undocumented communities that they or their families may be investigated further, especially now where so many are under extra scrutiny and heightened fear. When you receive calls from community members who claim alleged harassment or discrimination at the office, what do you usually recommend, or how do you walk them through that just in your role as a community leader?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of what we've already covered, like about kind of like documentation, about seeking resources. If you do feel like you can say something at work, to say something at work about what you're experiencing. With something like sexual harassment, for example, sexual harassment is a form of sexual violence, and there are organizations that provide free services to people who are experiencing or have experienced sexual violence. So I think it's also about availing yourself of resources to support you. These can be very isolating experiences, and you can really feel like you have no power in the situation. So I think knowledge is power, so accessing knowledge, but then also knowing that there are organizations and individuals who can provide you support. It's not going to completely shield you from any possible consequences of coming forward, but it is not a road that you have to go down alone. And I think that's critical, especially if someone is experiencing any kind of shame or any other kind of emotional experience, or feeling like their families aren't going to understand, or those kinds of things, which just deepens the isolation. I think it's particularly important. And I think the other thing is just to, we also have to be really real. These are not things that get resolved quickly. I would love to say that they are, but the systems do take time. And so that's another reason why accessing sources of support is so critical, because it often doesn't get resolved quickly.
Thank you for sharing that. I think, especially the part that you don't have to do it alone. I feel oftentimes we feel that it's a me problem, but we can bring others in to support us and help navigate it. So thank you. I'm going to do a slight pivot. Tarina, you advise employers on promoting equity and compliance. Now we're seeing shifts in the DEI landscape around the country, especially at the federal level, and how these shifts are impacting how seriously employers may take protections. What's changed in actual practice?
Yeah, so I want to stress that DEI, any of those policies are basically internal policies within a company. So regardless of whether they're following them or they're rolling it back, people are still protected under state and federal anti-discrimination laws that we previously mentioned. So regardless of whether a company now actively promotes it, or now they're saying we're going to hire the most qualified candidate, they still can't discriminate based on race, gender, sexual orientations, all those protective traits that we talked about before.
Thank you. And Sharmili, have you seen changes in the enforcement or prioritization of policies that protect women in the workplace, internal policies?
So I think because just by nature of internal policies being internal, we do have limited insight on exactly what is happening. I think there are a few different ways that we've seen organizations or companies go. I think one is doubling down and being like, this is an internal policy. This is something that we are doing because it's an operational priority. We want to have, a robust workforce. We want people to feel included and safe. And this is how we're choosing to, go about that. So there are definitely companies that have just said, okay, I mean, you can, because the executive order at issue was targeting illegal DEI and also not defining what illegal DEI is. So it's very hard to comply with an executive order, which is, to Tarina's point, not a law. It is an executive order. There is a difference. It's hard to comply with something that is not defined, right? And so we have that. You have companies who are doing kind of like anticipatory compliance. So they just don't want to be on the radar of this administration. And they are just going ahead, and maybe they're closing down their DI programs. Maybe they're just renaming them. We're seeing that a lot too. They're not called diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now they're talking about expanding the workforce pipeline, just not talking about kind of the specifics of how it is that they want to do that as well. And then you have folks who are not just kind of like shifting the language, but they actually are like completely backing out, and they are firing their DEI officers, and they're removing their DEI strategies, and kind of like all of that kind of thing. So I think there are differences in how firms are going about that, and because they have very different attitudes around risk assessment, and companies have very different exposure as it relates to the federal government and possible scrutiny from the federal government, and their tolerance for that kind of scrutiny. I will say that one of the things that is different about having a law like Title VII, like Title IX, like Title X, all of what Tarina was talking about, and having enforcement of that law is a key place where this administration has, I think, driven a large wedge, which is the enforcement agencies have to have the capacity and priority of enforcing the law. So the law can still exist, but if the enforcement agency is shrunk to the point where they're not able to investigate every complaint, or if they're being told, as the EEOC has said, they are no longer going to prioritize or take on cases of discrimination against transgender people, then even if the laws exists and is interpreted in a particular way, the enforcement agency is not necessarily following up on that. And that's probably where I think we are losing the most ground, in addition to just like narrowing of interpretation of discrimination, harassment, et cetera. And it's also why local and state laws are so critical right now.
You raised so many good points, and especially the couple that I'm resonating with are the shrinking of a lot of our federal enforcement agencies significantly. And also, you raised an interesting point about, oh my gosh, I'm losing, my mind just totally blanked. But it was so good, and I'll come back to it, and I apologize. But we're talking about, you talked about a couple of the federal protections that are in place, Title VII, IX. Tarina, are there any other federal protections that are still in place that we can't lose sight of, even amidst these shifts? And then I remembered my other follow-up, which I'll raise after you.
Yeah, they're all still in place. So everything that we talked about before, the age discrimination, the disability, the Title IX, Title X, Title VII, those are all still in place. And then your state laws are still in place. So again, regardless of what's going on with DI rollbacks or no rollbacks or what companies are saying externally or internally, you're still protected under those laws against discrimination. And then to kind of add to Sharmili's point of the shrinking and not having enough money, for example, the EEOC to prosecute these cases or investigate these cases. I mean, the silver lining is I would recommend hire an attorney. So you would have to hire an attorney anyway, even if you filed with the EEOC, because at that point, either they have a backlog and they can't investigate your case. If they investigate your case, they might come back and say, we're not going to pursue it. Here's a right to sue letter. You can go ahead and hire an attorney and sue them yourself. And even if they did go forward and pursue a lawsuit against them, you still have your own statute of limitations. So you have a certain amount of time that you have to bring your case in. And usually what people would do is they'll hire an attorney simultaneously while the investigative body is also pursuing that case. So like the California Civil Rights Department could be suing Cisco for caste discrimination, and the plaintiffs could have their own case simultaneously going at the same time. So my suggestion is hire an attorney early to guide you through it, to kind of walk you through what the strengths and weaknesses of your case are, to guide you through while you're at work, how you should be documenting things, how you should be, like Sharmili said, take screenshots, forward emails that basically say exclusionary things or discriminatory things. Yeah, so just hire an attorney early.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And I think it's just a reminder that these protections are still in place beyond the rollbacks. I remembered my not so brilliant thought, and thank you both for the grace in that. But Sharmili, you talked a little bit about companies want to stay off of the radar of the federal government. So in my experience as a civil rights attorney, after George Floyd, we want to show how protective we are of our most vulnerable communities. Let's offer protections. Let's hire these DEI. We saw an increase of DEI staff around the country, from universities to to places of employment and governments, local and state. And now when the executive order was signed, everyone was so quick to jump the gun. Is it because they want to stay off the radar, or is there something, is it maybe it was the value they never really fully agreed with? What do you think?
I mean, I think that's a fair question, and it does make you wonder whether the investment was actually more performative and surface than it was meant to be integrated and truly create structural change. Um, the I think the jury is out on that. I think the business case for diversity has been made time and time again. And there is just so much evidence that having diversity, and when I say diversity, I mean kind of like race and gender, and sexual orientation, but I also mean diversity of thought, diversity of lived experience, right? Like, there is just so much evidence that having that kind of broad diversity just improves the bottom line for companies. And so I think some companies at least are really caught in this, they may be risk averse when it comes to what's happening at the federal level, but they also have an incentive of having, a high quality workforce and high retention, and being able to attract really good people. And diversity, equity, and inclusion does that. So I do think that we are still seeing a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion policies internally in companies that are just not being trumpeted as much as maybe they were with George Floyd. After George Floyd, I also think we have to be realistic. Companies are in it to make money. They're in it to protect their contracts. We have been seeing a lot about companies who are trying to get federal approval for a merger, or federal approval for expanding their business in some way, and there's an incentive for them as a result, a financial incentive to comply with what they perceive to be the administration's expectations. So I'm not an apologist by any means, but I do think that we have to be realistic about what it is that is actually being balanced. And I actually don't think the impact on the individual workers and the impact on our communities is necessarily top of mind.
That's fair. Thank you. Tarina, anything to add?
No, great.
Thank you. Trina, for you, I know there was a question in the Q&A as well. What are some of the biggest gaps in current workplace protections, especially for contract workers, gig workers, or people working in non-unionized settings?
Yeah, so besides contract workers not getting like medical, healthcare, paid for overtime, those basic things that an employee would get, federal law also, including Title VII, doesn't extend anti-discrimination protections to independent contractors. And some states can sometimes expand on that because they see that gap and they say, hey, we do want to protect them. But even in California, so you have the Fair Employment and Housing Act, which also doesn't protect contract workers except for in harassment cases. So there's a huge just a huge gap with what employees are protected against and what independent contractors are protected against.
Thank you for that. Can you talk a little bit about pay equity? I know you led some work on equal pay transparency, and it seems to be a big, I know we were talking earlier, and you mentioned women are paid at 30% of what men are paid for doing the same work. And if I misheard that number, but could you talk a little bit more about why this is still in 2025 such a big problem?
Yeah. So I think the numbers are like a white woman is paid around 89 cents to every dollar a white man makes. A Black woman is paid, I think, 66 cents to a dollar, and have Sharmili like chime in because I'm sure she knows the exact numbers more. But there's a huge discrepancy, and that adds up, right? That adds up over your lifetime. Your women are losing millions and millions of dollars because they're not getting paid the same amount as men. And the problem is these little things that people don't notice, these subtle things that happen when you go to interview at a company. The company will ask you, how much did you make at your old company? How much did you make at your old firm? And what that does is if one company decided to pay you less, now you're stuck with that because each company is going to only give it to you there. So what California did was it changed and strengthened its pay equity laws, and they don't allow companies to ask new hirees what they were making at their old firm. So you're not allowed to do that. They're also are required to give you a range of how much they pay their employees. So you're not walking into an interview not knowing like, how much should I be taking for this? You know, there's this case, it was a Jones Day case, a Asian woman associate got hired at Jones Day. They offered her really good money. She thought it was really good money. She was really excited by it. And then come to know a year or 2 years down the line that her male counterpart was making nearly double of what she was making. So there's not a lot of transparency around what people are making. And also, if you don't have a range, you have no idea what you should be asking for. And then the last one I'll mention is there are a lot of companies that stop employees from talking about how much other people are making, because then you can gauge how much you should be making. And you're not allowed to do that. So you're not allowed to do that under federal law. You're not allowed to do that under state law. Well, at least in California, you're not allowed to. So keep that in mind also.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I've worked at places where it's like, oh, we don't talk about our salary with one another. And it's always been very suspect, it's like, and you could see the huge pay inequity between different staff members, and it led to resentment because people do end up talking, right? And then you hear the truth of what that is, and it just creates a culture that no one really wants to be a part of. Sharmili, anything to add?
Can I add to that? Yeah, because I think there's also a generational difference that we're like definitely seeing. I think newer college grads, for example, or younger folks are really sharing a lot more information about salaries and about money, period. So I think that we're really seeing a cultural shift in expectations. And in fact, Adobe did a survey showing like upwards of 80+% of college grads said that they wouldn't even apply for a job unless they actually saw a salary range included in the job posting. Along with California, Illinois, also we actually successfully advocated for a salary transparency law here, and that went into effect in this year, January of this year. We also did the salary history ban that Tarina was talking about. And I think these are also great examples of how local and state laws are different from federal. There's something called the Paycheck Fairness Act that has been that has not gotten into law at the federal level and includes some of these protections. But there are states in which these protections have moved forward as well. I'll just add one more thing related to equal pay, and that is that the gender wage gap is, yes, about kind of what we were describing as like one employee versus another employee and like how much they're making in relationship to another. But the gender wage gap is also about occupational segregation, which is this idea that that women of color, immigrant women, are overrepresented in low paid roles and underrepresented in high paid roles. And that a lot of those low paid roles are what are typically associated with women's labor. And so it's like, it's also about how what women do, whether it's like caregiving, childcare, teaching, like a lot of these roles, tends to be undervalued in our society. And that's also a piece of what we need to talk about when we're talking about pay equity.
Yeah, I would love to add to that too, is companies also get women or people of color to then chair their DEI initiative or to do extra work, and then now they're not getting paid for it. So like for law firms, I always tell law students, look at how many equity partners are people of color, how many women are equity partners. We're in 2025. You shouldn't be blazing the trail as the first woman at this law firm. Like someone should have already done it. Like don't go work there. Yeah, just want to point that out.
Thank you both for uplifting that. Let's pivot again. We already talked about steps people could take if they believe they've experienced discrimination, both internally and externally. Was there anything missing, anything that we should flag that our viewers should take note of before they're ready to take action for facing discrimination? And no is totally okay as well.
Nothing's coming to mind at the moment.
If you get any bright thoughts, please do feel free to share them. But Sharmili, can you share some community-based resources or supports for women and low-wage workers navigating these challenges? Can you just talk about some of them that may exist?
Yeah, so I think particularly what I'll start with is low-wage workers. Workers' rights centers are such a critical resource for low-wage workers. We have an amazing coalition of workers' rights centers in Chicago called Raise the Floor Alliance that have member organizations, member workers' rights centers. And these are organizations that are really set up to help workers know what their rights are and know how to demand that those rights are respected. And it really is about bringing workers together because there is strength in numbers, especially when there's the vulnerability of, you know, being a low-paid worker and trying to make something better in your workplace. So I think that's really critical. I think to Tarina's point about getting an attorney, the National Employment Lawyer Association has kind of state chapters. And so there's a place that you can go if you feel like you need to speak to an employment attorney. There are often organizations that provide legal aid. So like legal aid societies that if you have limited income, can provide pro bono or discounted legal support and advice as well. So I think those are just a couple of examples of where people can go, and obviously very driven by where you are. But those things do exist, and I think are kind of working overtime right now, to be honest.
No, I appreciate that. And just as a follow-up to that, you're at a community-based organization pushing policy and other efforts. Where are you seeing the impact and how, what are some other examples or ways local and community advocacy can successfully push back against discrimination?
Yeah, I'm thinking of three examples that are all very different from one another. One is that there's a local organization called Chicago Women in Trades, which has been focused on, as the name implies, getting women into trades because trades are very lucrative professions and they don't require college degrees, but they are also significantly male dominated and are not always set up to welcome women and non-binary folks. They were their federal funding was rescinded, and they are actually filing a lawsuit against the Trump administration, which is challenging the executive orders related to DEI. So there's like one way that we see an organization fighting back, and there is so much litigation right now going on as it relates to the Trump administration's actions as well. Our ICER, which is the Illinois, oh my gosh, Immigrant and Refugee Rights, was like blanked for a second. They have been so successful at getting know your rights information out. So much so that the Department of Homeland Security was frustrated and irritated about the fact that immigrants in Illinois and immigrant workers in Illinois were so knowledgeable about what their rights are. So organizations like that, and ICER, there's a number of organized communities against deportation. There are a few others that are local and these organizations also have affiliates of sister organizations other places in the country. And then the last thing I will mention is the 75 Million Project. And Women Employed is one of the organizations that is kind of like helping to steer. This is a effort that is co-led by the National Women's Law Center and the National Partnership for Women and Families. And it's all about really uplifting how attacking DEI is really attacking women, and how when you make diversity, equity, and inclusion, when you pull back on those policies, the people that you are harming are overwhelmingly women. And making sure that people understand that women are really key to the economic prosperity of this country. So those are kind of like three, like I said, very different examples of ways that people are not just pushing back, like not just defending and protecting, but also trying to advance and still make sure that we're able to strengthen what we have as well.
So important, and thank you. Tarina, anything to add?
I just want to add on a previous point when we're talking about hiring an attorney and legal aid clinics that are available. So most attorneys will take your case as an employee against your employee on a contingency fee basis, which means that they won't take any money up front and will take a percentage of whatever the settlement amount is. So personally, for me, if I feel like a client has a really strong case and the facts and the law on our side, then I'm willing to take that financial risk and put in money, my own money. And if we don't win, then my client owes me nothing. But if we win, then I get a percentage of the settlement. So just want to point that out too, is there are a lot of attorneys where you don't have to pay anything to kind of pursue a valid claim.
That's so helpful. Thank you. Tarina, question for you. You worked on a caste bill in California where an individual faced discrimination in the workplace based on their caste. So it wasn't just a legal effort. Can you talk a little bit about how important it is to work not only from a legal way, but advocacy, policy, community, why all those pieces are so important?
Yeah, those pieces are incredibly important. So I'll just back up a little bit even from that. Most of the issues that we see with employment cases is there's forced arbitration. So when you sign an employment contract with your employer, there's an arbitration clause which prevents you from filing a lawsuit in court, and you have to go through arbitration. There are also sometimes class waivers. That means, for example, Disney settled an over $43 million case for pay inequity, gender pay inequity, and that was under a class action. So if there's a class waiver and you sign that, then you can't bring a claim as a group. And companies lobby and put in a lot of money to strengthen arbitration provisions or to defend arbitration provisions. They lobby for those things. Like PG&E put in a lot of money to prevent basically residents who were affected by the fires in California. So there's a lot of work being done in the background as far as who has the money and who gets to basically control the narrative and come out a winner. And then with the caste bill, to your question specifically, we were trying to add caste as an expressly protected category within the FEHA provision in California. So that would prevent an employer from discriminating against an employee based on what caste they were. And the opposition had so much money. They were lobbying so hard on spreading misinformation, on reaching out to representatives, on buying politicians. saying they were going to pull out money from the party if the bill wasn't vetoed. And Washington Post did this entire expose on it. But I mean, this was the moment where you see how sausages get made, and it's so frustrating because you're on the right side of things, but really who ends up winning is people with money. But to end on a positive note, the way we also get employers to make a change is by filing a lawsuit, because that's what makes them want to change. You know, I wish they would want to change inherently, like this is a bad policy and, you know, we shouldn't have this. But when they see that lawsuit, then incentivizes them to kind of look internally, see what systemic issues that they have, who's not being protected, and what changes they can implement going forward.
Thank you so much. I know there's a question in the Q&A, and you touched upon the answer, but if you're fired because of discrimination, are there things someone should consider in a settlement beyond money? So you talk about some of the systemic issues that may exist in the workplace. Sharmili, it says that you're going to answer the question live, so I wanted to
I was
pass
just
it on.
proposing that we answer the question live, but yeah, and I think Tarina probably has more to say about this, but absolutely, you know, there's a whole range of, like, what they talk about is being made whole. And that's basically like trying to repair, right, the damage that was done by the discrimination that you experienced. And so not only can it be being reinstated in your job, it can be back pay, it can be maybe you had to seek counseling or healthcare because of the experience of discrimination. And so those were costs that you incurred. Maybe you were denied a promotion, and so it is retroactive. You get the promotion plus all of the back pay that you would have gotten. It might be clearing your personnel record because there might be unfair things in your personnel record that you want to make sure are gone. So there can be, yes, financial is a piece of it. But you also see sometimes that companies have to engage in training around being non-discriminatory. Companies can be monitored as well as to whether or not they are successfully abiding by the law and making the changes that they need to. And these are things that can happen as a result of a complaint that you file as well. But Tarina, I think you'll probably have things to add to that too.
Yeah, I would go even a step further. All those are great. I would go a step further and say, you know, anything's on the table. So if you want, for example, an apology from the person who maybe harassed you or created the hostile work environment, you can have that be part of the negotiation process. If you were sexually assaulted, you can say, I want you to fire this person, but I want to continue working at this company. I don't want to just be relocated. So that could be part of the conversation. So it's really everything is on the table. It's just a matter of, you know, what leverage do you have and whether they're going to listen to you or not.
Thank you, thank you, thank you for your brilliant words today. We're about to wrap up. I'd love to give you both an opportunity to share any last words with our viewers before we wrap up. Tarina, I'll start with you. No pressure.
I was just gonna say, Sharmili, everything that she said, I agree with her. I think I'll just stress again for the non-attorneys on here, just hire an attorney early in the process who can guide you through it. You know, there are a lot of things that you don't think about that are on the table. And if you have someone in your corner, they can kind of guide you through that. And like I pointed out, there are people who take your case for free in upfront and then take a percentage of the settlement if they win the case for you. So they are attorneys who are willing to consult with you, to guide you, and be there with you through a process that can be, like we talked about, really isolating and convoluted. And yeah, but I'll end on that.
Sharmili?
I think it is really critical, especially right now, that we know what our rights are. And that means everything from reading that personnel policies manual that you got your first day and you signed that you read it, even though you didn't really read it, except what your time off rights were. Reading it, making sure you know where you can go if you experience any kind of discrimination, what the organization's policies are, all of that kind of thing. But then also knowing your legal rights above and beyond the policies that the organization has, because organizational personnel policies don't always cover, and most often don't actually cover everything that you have a right to, and may not always be the most updated representation of what your rights are. So I think know your rights. And then I've said it before, but I will emphasize you are not alone, even though you may feel very alone. And it is really critical to know that that is not the case, that there are people there who will support you, and that you don't deserve to be treated unfairly. I mean, at a very, very basic level, it's not your fault. And so I think it's important for us to remember that, especially when people are blamed for the harm that they are experiencing.
Thank you so much. I'd like to thank again our brilliant panelists, Tarina and Sharmili, for not only helping us understand the legal landscape, but for making at least my heart much lighter, knowing that there's leaders like them both out there who are doing this work and advocating for those that are facing discrimination, harassment, and violence. So thank you. We've talked today about the changing laws, the rollbacks, the challenges, but also the resilience. And it's the ways that we continue to show up, speak up, and protect one another, as both of our brilliant panelists are doing every day. And if there's one thing that we want to take away from this conversation, it's this, that we are not alone. Our rights matter, our voice matters, and that there's people out there who are fighting every day to make sure that we are seen, we're heard, and we are protected. So let's keep pushing for workplaces that just don't check the boxes, but do center our collective justice. Before we wrap up, just a few quick notes. SAAPRI is currently conducting a live survey to better understand the experiences of South Asian immigrants. Our voices are important, and we'd love if you could take a few minutes to complete the survey. The link is available on SAAPRI's website, and we'll be emailing it out to all the participants and attendees today. We'll also be compiling notes and key takeaways from our panel and sharing them as a resource with the attendees, so please stay tuned for that in coming weeks. And our next panel coming up on September 8th will be Amplifying Community Voices, the stories behind the headlines. And you can register on the SAAJCO or SAAPRI websites, and we'll be emailing that out as well. Thank you again for joining us for tonight's conversation. We hope this was an insightful and engaging contribution to our Engaged Community series. We'll see you soon. Thank you.
Recording stopped.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I'll see you on the other Zoom. If you need a little break, I'll just take your time.
Okay. Thanks again.
Bye-bye.